Imagine living in a country that calls itself the land of freedom, yet where the very law you must obey could strip away the freedom of others and even put you at risk if you choose to help. In 1850, the United States passed one of the harshest laws in its history, the Fugitive Slave Act. This law was not just a set of rules. It was a moral test imposed on an entire nation. It mandated that any runaway slave had to be returned to their owner, and anyone who assisted them even with a simple meal, a place to rest, or guidance on the path to freedom could face fines or imprisonment. The consequences were severe, the choices impossible, and the stakes unimaginably high. To understand the impact of this law, we must step back and look at the world it sought to control. Slavery was deeply embedded in American society. Millions of men, women, and children were considered property, subjected to long hours of grueling labor, physical punishment, and the emotional torment of being separated from family. Escape was a dream many held close to their hearts, a vision of a life where one could walk freely, make choices, and reunite with loved ones. But running away was no simple task. Slave catchers patrolled the land, often armed and relentless, using tracking dogs and intimidation to capture anyone attempting freedom. For many, even reaching the northern states, where slavery was illegal, did not guarantee safety. The Fugitive Slave Act transformed the stakes even further. It extended the reach of slavery into free states, forcing ordinary citizens to participate in a system of oppression. People who might have seen helping a neighbor as an act of kindness now faced legal punishment for doing so. Judges were often biased, ruling in favor of slave catchers, and the accused had little chance to defend themselves. Free African Americans were under constant threat of being kidnapped and falsely accused, their lives hanging in the balance simply because of the color of their skin. But amid this darkness, stories of courage and defiance emerged. Ordinary citizens, driven by conscience and compassion, risked everything to oppose the law. Secret networks known as the Underground Railroad guided countless enslaved people toward freedom. Figures like Harriet Tubman and Levi Coffin became symbols of bravery, their actions demonstrating that even in the most oppressive systems, resistance was possible. In this video, we will journey into that perilous world, uncovering the human stories behind the law and exploring how courage, hope, and determination shaped the fight for freedom. You will meet those who risked everything for justice and see the consequences of a law designed to control lives and crush humanity. Their experiences remind us that freedom is not just a legal concept, it is a right worth defending, and sometimes that defense requires extraordinary courage. If you want to dive deeper into these stories and understand the history that shaped the struggle for freedom in America, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter of this incredible journey. Let us explore this dark period of history together and discover the lessons it holds for all of us today. As we continue our journey into the mid-19th century, it is impossible to overstate the harsh reality that enslaved people faced every single day, a reality that shaped every aspect of their existence from dawn until long after the sun had set. Life on the plantations was a relentless cycle of labor, exhaustion, and fear, and for those born into bondage, it was a world where freedom was an abstract idea whispered in the quiet corners of shared quarters and secret gatherings. The fields stretched endlessly, rows upon rows of crops demanding attention from men, women, and even children whose small hands were forced to toil alongside adults. There was no room for rest beyond the short, hurried breaks dictated by overseers who measured work in yield and productivity rather than human endurance, and any attempt to resist, slow down, or complain was met with swift punishment. Whippings, beatings, and public shaming were tools not just to enforce obedience but to instill a pervasive fear that ensured compliance. A fear designed to erase the thought of freedom from the mind, even as it burned quietly in the hearts of those forced to labor under the sun. The work itself was only part of the burden. The emotional and psychological toll of separation from family was equally devastating, though far less visible to the outside world. Children were torn from their parents' arms and sent to distant plantations. Husbands and wives separated without warning. Siblings scattered across counties, all in the cruel calculus of profit and control. Imagine a mother clutching her newborn, the only comfort she could offer stolen away when a trader arrived to sell the child to the highest bidder. Or a father watching helplessly as his family disappeared down a dirt road with no hope of reunion. These separations were not temporary. In many cases, they were permanent, a strategy designed to break bonds, to reduce the chance of resistance, and to remind every enslaved individual that they were regarded as property first and human beings second. The emotional scars of these separations endured for generations, shaping communities even after slavery was abolished. A reminder of the depth of human suffering inflicted by an institution built on exploitation. Even within the oppressive routine of work, enslaved individuals displayed remarkable resilience, creating spaces of humanity and resistance wherever possible. Songs, stories, and whispered conversations became lifelines, ways to maintain culture, identity, and hope in a world designed to suppress them. Families formed bonds with neighbors, with other enslaved people who became surrogate kin, sharing knowledge about survival, secret paths for escape, and small acts of defiance. Every act of teaching a child to read in secret, every whispered word of encouragement to a runaway, every subtle act of non-compliance was a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be wholly subdued, even under circumstances engineered to strip away dignity and autonomy. The physical labor itself was grueling, but it was the constant presence of abuse that turned daily life into a ceaseless struggle. Overseers patrolled the fields with authority and intimidation, sometimes without the presence of the plantation owner, wielding tools of enforcement that could inflict immediate pain, leaving marks visible for weeks, months, or years. Those who fell ill had little access to medical care beyond rudimentary remedies, and the demands of labor did not diminish for sickness, hunger, or fatigue. The very rhythm of life was dictated by crops, seasons, and the financial interests of those who profited from forced labor, leaving little room for compassion or mercy. Yet within these harsh conditions, acts of endurance, cleverness, and courage emerged, revealing the ways in which enslaved individuals navigated a system designed to render them powerless. They learned to anticipate the moods of overseers, to hide resources, to communicate secretly, and sometimes to plan escapes that, if successful, could offer a taste of freedom that sustained hope even in the darkest moments. Families, despite being under constant threat of separation, often found ways to preserve bonds. Community networks of mutual support developed, not only to share resources and knowledge, but to provide comfort and protection against the psychological impact of enslavement. Rituals, faith, and music became forms of resistance as well, ways to assert individuality and humanity when external forces sought to deny it. Each story of a mother sending a secret message to her child, of a husband keeping a promise to meet again in the face of impossible odds, or of neighbors offering a hidden meal or a place to hide, reflects the extraordinary courage and resilience required to endure such a life. Even the smallest victories, such as securing an extra meal, learning a skill, or secretly celebrating a birthday or religious holiday, were acts of defiance against a system that sought to render individuals invisible and powerless. These moments, though fleeting, provided hope, a reminder that humanity could not be entirely extinguished, and that the bonds of love and family, though under constant threat, could persist. Understanding the daily reality of forced labor, abuse, and family separations is crucial because it frames the significance of the broader struggle for freedom. It highlights why the risk of escape, the courage of those who aided fugitives, And the moral resistance against laws like the Fugitive Slave Act were not abstract ideals, they were matters of life, dignity, and human survival. The enduring strength, intelligence, and humanity of enslaved people, despite relentless oppression, set the stage for the stories of heroism, escape, and resistance that would ultimately challenge the institution of slavery itself, creating ripples that shaped history in profound and lasting ways. Even as the sun rose over the vast plantations of the South, casting its golden light across endless fields of cotton and tobacco, a flicker of hope glimmered in the hearts of those who dreamed of freedom beyond the boundaries of enforced labor. A hope so potent that it could outweigh the constant threat of violence and punishment. For many enslaved people, escaping to a free state or venturing all the way to Canada was not merely an act of defiance. It was a declaration of their humanity, a refusal to accept a life where their bodies and spirits were treated as property. The journey, however, was fraught with danger from the very moment the decision to flee was made. As the shadow of slave catchers loomed large across the land, their presence an omnipresent reminder of the peril that accompanied every step toward liberty. These men were hired, armed, and relentless, trained to pursue with the single-minded purpose of returning fugitives to bondage. And their tactics were often brutal, leaving no room for mercy or negotiation. To escape was to embrace uncertainty at every turn. Those who attempted flight had to navigate dense forests, treacherous rivers, and miles of open countryside, often at night, relying on instinct, knowledge passed down through whispers, and sometimes the guidance of allies who risked their own safety to provide food, shelter, and direction. The risks were immense. Capture did not simply mean returning to a plantation. It could mean severe physical punishment, further separation from family, or public humiliation meant to instill fear in others who might consider following the same path. Even a brief mistake, a misstep along a hidden trail or a wrong turn into a neighbor's field, could lead to discovery. And once found, fugitives were often met with aggression designed to enforce obedience and ensure they would never attempt escape again. The pursuit of freedom was also complicated by the Fugitive Slave Act, which extended the reach of slavery into the very states where freedom was supposedly guaranteed, turning neighbors, shopkeepers, and local officials into potential instruments of capture. The law required that anyone aiding an escaped slave could face imprisonment or heavy fines, making acts of compassion fraught with legal danger. It transformed ordinary communities into zones of moral tension, where helping a neighbor could become a criminal act, and walking alone could invite suspicion, harassment, or worse. For free African Americans living in these regions, the threat was even more acute. The line between liberty and bondage could be erased in an instant by a false accusation, and many lived under constant anxiety, knowing that freedom was fragile and could be taken away at the whim of those empowered by law to enforce an immoral system. Despite these dangers, the journey to freedom inspired extraordinary courage and ingenuity. Escaped slaves developed networks of signals, secret paths, and safe houses that allowed them to navigate a landscape designed to prevent their flight. Every mile traveled was a testament to endurance and determination, as fugitives had to outwit those who hunted them, often traveling under the cover of darkness, hiding in swamp, fields, or attics, relying on the kindness of strangers who understood the risk and shared their commitment to justice. Stories passed down through generations recount the clever disguises, the careful timing of movements, and the silent communication that made escape possible, creating a tapestry of courage woven from small but critical acts of defiance. One could imagine a young man moving cautiously along a narrow trail, each rustle of leaves sending a surge of adrenaline through his veins, knowing that a single sound could alert pursuers, while the promise of reaching a free state or the border of Canada fueled every step forward. Families often made the journey in secret, carrying what little they could, navigating both natural obstacles and the constant threat of betrayal by those willing to profit from their recapture. Every safe house reached, every conductor met along the route, became a moment of reprieve and a symbol that freedom was attainable, even if only incrementally. The dangers were not abstract. They were immediate and life-altering. Many fugitives were caught only a few miles from safety, returned to harsh punishments, or forced into harsher labor as a deterrent to others. Yet, for those who succeeded, the relief was profound, a tangible taste of liberty that justified the enormous risks. Crossing into a free state or into Canada represented not only the avoidance of physical violence, but the reclamation of identity, dignity, and the ability to chart one's own course in life, away from the constant oppression that had defined their existence. This relentless struggle for freedom underscores the human spirit's capacity to resist even in the face of overwhelming odds, demonstrating that the desire for autonomy and self-determination can inspire acts of bravery and resourcefulness that resonate far beyond individual stories. The journeys of these individuals were not solitary. They were connected by shared knowledge, solidarity, and a collective hope that each successful escape would inspire others, proving that the forces of compassion, courage, and moral conviction could confront even the most entrenched systems of oppression. Through forests, across rivers, and along hidden trails, the flight of enslaved people toward freedom became a living testament to resilience, illustrating the extraordinary lengths to which humans will go to reclaim their right to live freely, and setting the stage for a broader struggle that would challenge and eventually dismantle an entire system built on human suffering. By the mid-19th century, the United States was a nation teetering on the edge of moral and political turmoil, and the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 acted like a spark thrown onto an already volatile landscape, igniting tensions that would eventually culminate in civil war. The law, far from being a neutral piece of legislation, was a stark reflection of the deep divisions that had long existed between the northern states, where the ideals of liberty and emancipation were gradually taking root, and the southern states, where the economy, society, and culture were inextricably bound to the institution of slavery. By mandating that escaped enslaved individuals be returned to their owners and criminalizing anyone who offered assistance, no matter how small, the law effectively extended the reach of the slave-holding system into territories that had once been considered safe havens, forcing citizens to confront an ethical dilemma in which neutrality was impossible. Ordinary people who might have considered offering food, shelter, or guidance to a fleeing individual now faced the chilling prospect of fines or imprisonment, and communities found themselves divided between adherence to law and adherence to conscience, between self-preservation and moral courage. In northern towns and cities, the Fugitive Slave Act was met with outrage and resistance. Abolitionists, clergy, and ordinary citizens recognized the law for what it was: a deliberate intrusion of an oppressive system into their daily lives, and a direct challenge to their values of justice and human dignity. Meetings were convened in churches, public spaces, and private homes to organize opposition, and pamphlets and newspapers carried stories that highlighted the law's cruelty, emphasizing the injustice of forcibly returning people who had risked everything for the chance at freedom. For many Northerners, the legislation created a moral imperative: to act, to resist, and to provide sanctuary despite the legal risks. In this context, aiding a fugitive was no longer a simple act of charity or compassion. It became a form of quiet rebellion, an assertion of ethical authority against a government that had chosen to prioritize property over human life. Meanwhile, in the South, the law was celebrated as a necessary reinforcement of a way of life that was perceived to be under threat. Plantation owners and political leaders argued that the Fugitive Slave Act was essential to protect their economic interests and social order. framing resistance in the North as a dangerous affront to the rule of law and an invitation to chaos. Newspapers in the South often depicted runaway slaves as inherently deceitful and morally corrupt, casting those who assisted them as criminals or traitors. The result was a widening chasm between North and South, with each region increasingly entrenched in its own worldview, and the nation as a whole drifting further from compromise. The law did more than punish actions. It reshaped relationships, sowed suspicion, and forced communities to navigate the treacherous waters of divided loyalty, making everyday interactions fraught with tension and fear. In this environment, courageous individuals emerged who risked everything to defy the law. Conductors on the Underground Railroad, both black and white, operated in secret, guiding escaping slaves through perilous terrain and coordinating networks of safe houses that spanned thousands of miles. Each act of assistance carried the potential for legal retribution. Yet those involved persisted, motivated by a deep sense of justice and the belief that freedom was an inalienable right. Their bravery highlighted the stark contrast between law and morality, illustrating that legality does not always equate to righteousness, and that ethical action often requires defiance of unjust authority. In northern cities like Boston, cases such as that of Anthony Burns, who was captured under the Fugitive Slave Act despite years of living as a free man, galvanized public sentiment, leading to mass protests, civil disobedience, and intense debates about the nation's conscience and future. These events demonstrated the law's power to polarize, but they also revealed the potential for collective action to challenge injustice, showing that the will of the people could confront even the most oppressive statutes. The law's ripple effects were felt not only in acts of resistance, but in the broader political arena. Tensions over slavery, long simmering beneath the surface of national discourse, intensified as northern states enacted personal liberty laws and other measures designed to circumvent or mitigate the impact of the Fugitive Slave Act. While Southern leaders demanded stricter enforcement and federal intervention, the resulting impasse created a feedback loop of mistrust and animosity, reinforcing sectional identities and making compromise increasingly elusive. For the general populace, this meant that even mundane decisions, whether to assist a neighbor, attend a community meeting, or speak out in public, became loaded with political and moral significance. Each action a reflection of one's stance on the issue of slavery. Families and friends found themselves divided along ideological lines, and the fabric of society in both regions was strained as citizens navigated the tension between legal obligation and moral conviction. Ultimately, the Fugitive Slave Act illustrates how law can serve as a catalyst for conflict when it enforces a system that denies fundamental human rights, demonstrating the profound consequences of legislating immorality. By criminalizing the act of helping those seeking freedom and imposing federal authority over local conscience, it deepened the already existing North-South divide and set the stage for an inevitable confrontation. The law did not simply regulate behavior, it tested the ethical boundaries of a nation, forcing individuals to confront the question of what justice truly means and what sacrifices they were willing to make to uphold it. In exploring the human stories and political tensions that surrounded this legislation, we gain a deeper understanding of how courage, conscience, and collective resistance can challenge systems of oppression and ultimately shape the course of history. The Fugitive Slave Act was more than a law, it was a moral battleground that revealed both the worst and the best of humanity. A defining moment that brought the nation closer to the momentous struggle of civil war. Even in the northern states, where slavery had been abolished and the promise of freedom was legally recognized, life for free African Americans was fraught with danger, a danger that lurked in the shadows of a society still dominated by fear, prejudice, and the relentless reach of the Fugitive Slave Act. Being legally free offered no absolute protection. The law itself, designed to uphold the property rights of slaveholders, created a world in which a simple accusation could upend an entire life. A neighbor's suspicion, a passing comment, or even the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time could trigger a chain of events that transformed freedom into imprisonment almost overnight. False accusations were not anomalies but a recurring threat, and free African Americans were acutely aware that their liberty depended as much on chance and vigilance as it did on legal status. The ever-present risk forced families to live cautiously, to scrutinize every interaction, and to develop a constant awareness of who could be trusted and what could be said aloud, creating an atmosphere of tension that seeped into every corner of daily existence. The mechanisms of this oppression were insidious. Slave catchers, emboldened by law, could arrest anyone suspected of being an escaped slave without substantial proof, and the burden of defending oneself fell heavily on the accused, who often had no legal recourse. Courts and commissioners were generally predisposed to rule in favor of the claimants, prioritizing the demands of the Fugitive Slave Act over fairness or due process. In this system, even a free person could find themselves torn from family, stripped of possessions, and sent into a world of forced labor based on the flimsiest of evidence or a fraudulent claim. The emotional and psychological toll of such threats was immense, fostering a pervasive anxiety that permeated both private and public life, leaving no space truly free from fear. Children grew up understanding that their security was precarious. Parents weighed every choice against potential disaster, and communities developed intricate networks of mutual aid and cautionary communication to protect themselves as best they could. Despite these constant dangers, free African Americans demonstrated remarkable resilience and ingenuity. They forged bonds with allies, both black and white, who were willing to risk legal repercussions to offer assistance, guidance, or sanctuary. Underground networks, informal support systems, and even simple gestures of solidarity became lifelines, enabling families to navigate a society that often treated them as targets rather than citizens. These acts of resistance were not merely practical, they were also profoundly moral, asserting the fundamental dignity of people who had been trained to navigate a world that systematically dehumanized them. Every act of precaution, every coded message, and every decision to seek safe routes reflected a combination of courage and strategy. As free African Americans sought to maintain autonomy and protect their loved ones in an environment structured to strip away both. The vulnerability of free African Americans was perhaps most poignantly illustrated in cases where neighbors, opportunists, or even distant claimants exploited the law for personal gain. A single accusation could result in months of imprisonment while the courts determined the legitimacy of a claim. And during this time, families were torn apart, livelihoods disrupted, and individuals subjected to the same brutal treatment as escaped slaves. The system blurred the lines between free citizens and those in bondage, making legal status insufficient protection and forcing people to constantly negotiate, persuade, and sometimes flee preemptively to avoid entrapment. The fear of being falsely accused created a climate in which vigilance was a daily necessity, and survival depended on awareness, alliances, and sometimes sheer luck. Yet within this precarious existence, communities of free African Americans cultivated extraordinary strength. Churches, social organizations, and informal neighborhood networks became spaces where trust could be established and information shared, offering a measure of security and a sense of collective resilience. Elders passed down knowledge about identifying threats and navigating legal and social challenges, while neighbors watched for signs of danger and extended aid when possible. Even in the face of a legal system rigged against them, free African Americans managed to assert agency over their lives, making calculated decisions to protect themselves, their families, and their communities from the reach of slave catchers and the oppressive machinery of the Fugitive Slave Act. The broader implications of this constant threat were profound, shaping the social, cultural, and political life of free African Americans. It underscored the fragility of freedom in a society still dominated by racial prejudice and codified oppression, and it illuminated the stakes involved in resisting injustice. Assisting fugitives and fighting for systemic change. Every story of vigilance, every successful evasion of capture, and every act of solidarity was a testament to human ingenuity and courage in the face of relentless adversity. It was a world in which freedom was never guaranteed, yet the determination to maintain it, to protect family, and to support others in the pursuit of liberty was unwavering. Understanding the experiences of free African Americans under the Fugitive Slave Act reveals the law's far-reaching consequences, showing how it extended the shadow of slavery even into spaces where freedom was supposed to prevail. It was a legal structure that blurred the lines between liberty and oppression, compelling ordinary citizens to confront the harsh reality that freedom could be contested at any moment. And yet, the persistence, intelligence, and courage of those who lived under this constant threat left an enduring legacy, illustrating that the human spirit's determination for justice and dignity can flourish even under the most oppressive systems, shaping the broader struggle for emancipation and equal rights that would continue for generations to come. In the spring of 1854, the city of Boston became the stage for a drama that would expose the full extent of the Fugitive Slave Act's cruelty and ignite a fire within the abolitionist movement that reverberated across the nation, drawing the eyes of citizens, politicians, and activists alike to a single, harrowing case. Anthony Burns, a young man born into slavery in Virginia, had managed to escape the confines of bondage and make his way north, finding refuge in Boston, a city where he could live as a free man among a community of African Americans and sympathetic allies. Burns' life in Boston was a fragile triumph, one carefully nurtured amid the persistent dangers posed by the reach of federal law, and it represented a glimpse of hope for countless others who dreamed of freedom yet lived under the constant threat of capture. For years, Burns had labored quietly, building connections, contributing to his community, and embracing a life that, under ordinary circumstances, would have been unremarkable in its ordinariness. Yet in the context of an America divided by slavery, his very existence was a form of resistance. When federal marshals arrived to seize him under the authority of the Fugitive Slave Act, the city was thrust into a state of outrage and urgency, as neighbors and activists realized that the law could reach into the heart of northern freedom and strip an individual of liberty with bureaucratic formality and merciless efficiency. Burns was arrested and held in custody, his fate now entwined with the moral conscience of Boston itself. The legal process that followed was a demonstration of the Act's inherent bias, as commissioners and officials were bound by law to prioritize the demands of slaveholders over any consideration of justice or evidence, leaving Burns with little recourse and a city grappling with a profound ethical dilemma. In a courtroom that should have symbolized fairness and the rule of law, the scales were weighted against him, and the injustice of a free man being forcibly returned to slavery became a tangible public spectacle. The reaction in Boston was immediate and impassioned. Abolitionists from every corner of the city mobilized in an unprecedented display of solidarity and defiance, organizing protests, rallies, and public demonstrations that filled the streets with voices demanding justice. Thousands of citizens, black and white, gathered in support of Burns, carrying banners, chanting slogans, and confronting federal authorities with a moral clarity that transcended the legal parameters of the day. The city became a crucible in which the tensions between law and conscience, obedience and morality, were laid bare, forcing every resident to reckon with the ethical implications of a system that allowed human beings to be treated as property. Volunteers attempted daring interventions to secure Burns' freedom, including plans to rescue him from custody, And while these efforts ultimately did not prevent his return to Virginia, they crystallized the depth of local resistance and the collective courage of a community unwilling to remain passive in the face of blatant injustice. The capture of Anthony Burns resonated far beyond Boston's borders, drawing attention from newspapers, political leaders, and ordinary citizens throughout the North. His story became a symbol of the inhumanity inherent in the Fugitive Slave Act, illustrating how federal authority could be wielded to enforce an institution that treated people as commodities rather than human beings with inherent rights and dignity. The case revealed not only the personal tragedy of an individual torn from freedom, but also the broader moral crisis facing the nation, highlighting the impossibility of maintaining a divided country where some citizens could live freely while others were subjected to relentless oppression. In response, abolitionist networks strengthened their resolve, expanding their efforts to assist fugitives, educate the public, and challenge the legal framework that enabled such injustices, demonstrating the interconnection between individual stories and collective action in the struggle for liberation. Burns' ordeal also served as a catalyst for legal and political discourse, prompting Northern legislatures to examine the limits of federal power and inspiring debates over the morality of laws that criminalized compassion. Lawyers, activists, and politicians engaged in heated discussions about the rights of free citizens, the responsibilities of government, and the ethical imperatives that transcended statutory authority, creating an atmosphere in which the nation's conscience was openly contested and tested. The case became emblematic of the larger societal fault lines, illustrating how legislation designed to protect property could undermine freedom and provoke resistance, and how moral courage could emerge in response to institutionalized injustice. The emotional impact on Boston's African American community was profound, as families witnessed the tangible consequences of living under a law that could reach into their neighborhoods, remove a member of their community, and remind everyone that freedom was fragile and contingent. Yet the response was equally empowering, as collective action, solidarity, and moral clarity demonstrated the capacity of ordinary citizens to challenge oppressive systems and assert ethical priorities over compliance with unjust authority. Churches, social clubs, and private homes became sites of planning, discussion, and support, reinforcing networks of mutual aid that would continue to assist those seeking freedom long after Burns had been returned to Virginia. Ultimately, the story of Anthony Burns stands as a testament to the intersection of individual courage, a communal solidarity, and political resistance in the fight against slavery. His capture highlighted the stark brutality of a law that treated people as property, exposed the vulnerabilities of free and escaped African Americans alike, and galvanized a movement that would continue to grow in intensity and reach, laying the groundwork for the eventual dismantling of slavery in the United States. Through the lens of Burns' experience, we understand how personal narratives can illuminate systemic injustice, how public outcry can influence the course of history, and how the courage of individuals and communities can transform despair into a clarion call for freedom, equality, and enduring social change. Amid the relentless oppression imposed by the Fugitive Slave Act and the ever-present threat posed to both escaped and free African Americans, a remarkable network of courage, ingenuity, and unwavering commitment emerged, known as the Underground Railroad, a secretive and sprawling system of routes, safe houses, and human allies that transformed the perilous journey toward freedom from an individual struggle into a collective endeavor that spanned states and communities. Unlike a conventional railroad, it had no tracks, no locomotives, and no formal schedules. Yet it functioned with an astonishing level of coordination and precision, relying on the bravery and resourcefulness of people who risked their own safety to aid those fleeing the bonds of slavery. The Underground Railroad was not merely a logistical network. It was a moral lifeline, a symbol of resistance against an unjust system that sought to dehumanize and control, and it represented a profound commitment to the principles of liberty, justice, and human dignity in a society that often turned a blind eye to suffering. Among the most celebrated figures in this clandestine operation was Harriet Tubman, whose life became emblematic of courage and determination. Born into the harsh realities of slavery in Maryland, Tubman endured the physical and psychological traumas that accompanied forced labor and family separations. Yet she nurtured a relentless desire for freedom that propelled her to escape in 1849. What began as a personal quest soon expanded into a mission of liberation for others, as Tubman returned repeatedly to the South, risking capture, violence, and death to guide enslaved individuals northward to safety. She operated with remarkable skill, using knowledge of the terrain, coded messages, and trusted contacts to navigate through hostile territory, and her courage inspired countless others to act, showing that the fight for freedom was not solely the burden of the oppressed, but a collective responsibility shared by those who recognized the moral imperative to resist injustice. Tubman's missions were fraught with danger, often conducted at night, across rivers, swamps, and forests, yet she exhibited unwavering resolve, earning the reverent title of Moses for her role in leading her people to liberation. Each successful journey reinforced the strength of the network and the faith of those who dared to attempt escape, creating a ripple effect that empowered communities and emboldened the abolitionist movement. Equally vital to the operations of the Underground Railroad were individuals like Levi Coffin, a Quaker from North Carolina whose home became known as the Grand Central Station of the network. Coffin and his wife Catherine provided food, shelter, and guidance to hundreds of fugitive slaves, extending not only material assistance but also a profound moral affirmation of their worth and humanity. The Coffin's work illustrates how ordinary citizens, motivated by conscience rather than obligation, could wield significant influence in the struggle against systemic oppression, demonstrating the power of empathy and coordinated action. Their home served as a sanctuary, a temporary haven where fugitives could rest, plan the next stage of their journey, and regain strength, and their meticulous care and organizational acumen ensured that the network functioned with reliability despite constant threats from slave catchers and legal authorities. The Coffin's dedication exemplifies how moral conviction could translate into tangible action, and their efforts, combined with those of countless other conductors, created a web of protection that transformed the landscape of resistance. The success of the Underground Railroad depended not only on prominent figures but also on countless anonymous individuals whose contributions were no less significant. Farmers, tradespeople, clergy, and laborers provided covert support in myriad ways, from hiding escapees in attics or barns to supplying food, clothing, and directions to the next safe location. The network relied on a sophisticated system of signals and codes, lanterns, quilts, and discreet markings that allowed fugitives to navigate treacherous terrain without alerting those who might turn them over to slave catchers. Each act of assistance carried enormous risk, as federal law imposed harsh penalties on those caught aiding runaway slaves. Yet the participants were undeterred, motivated by a sense of justice that transcended personal safety and legal constraints. The cumulative effect of these coordinated efforts enabled tens of thousands of enslaved individuals to reach freedom, often traveling hundreds of miles through hostile territory, and fostered a sense of solidarity and shared purpose that extended far beyond individual journeys. The journeys along the Underground Railroad were perilous and required ingenuity, perseverance, and mutual trust. Fugitives faced the constant threat of betrayal, natural hazards, and the psychological strain of uncertainty, and each successful passage represented not merely an escape from physical bondage, but a reclamation of identity, dignity, and agency. Tubman, Coffin, and countless unnamed conductors transformed these journeys into structured yet adaptive operations. Emphasizing secrecy, timing, and coordination to maximize safety and effectiveness, their work illuminated the profound interconnectedness of courage, community, and strategy, showing that liberation was not achieved solely through isolated acts of bravery, but through the careful orchestration of collective effort. Moreover, the Underground Railroad played a critical role in galvanizing broader social and political resistance to slavery. Stories of successful escapes and the heroism of conductors circulated widely, inspiring abolitionists to intensify advocacy, organize support networks, and challenge the moral legitimacy of the Fugitive Slave Act and other oppressive laws. The network became a living symbol of defiance, demonstrating that legal authority could be contested through organized, principled action, and that ordinary citizens, guided by conscience and solidarity, could effect meaningful change even in the face of systemic injustice. In this way, the Underground Railroad exemplified the power of collaboration, courage, and moral conviction, revealing how individuals and communities could transform despair into hope and oppression into opportunity. Harriet Tubman, Levi Coffin, and the countless unnamed participants showed that the struggle for freedom was both deeply personal and inherently communal, that acts of compassion could serve as catalysts for systemic change, and that the pursuit of justice often requires both ingenuity and relentless determination. Their legacy endures as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, illustrating that even in the darkest periods, the light of courage, empathy, and unwavering commitment to liberty can guide generations toward freedom and dignity. In 1841, Solomon Northup, a free African-American man born and raised in the relative safety of New York, found himself at the center of one of the most harrowing personal tragedies to illustrate the cruel realities of American slavery. A story that would later resonate across generations and provide an unflinching look at the systemic brutality that defined the institution. Northup had grown up in a free household, his early life marked by education, family bonds, and the development of a skilled trade as a musician, a profession that allowed him to participate fully in his community, earning respect and contributing to the cultural fabric of his town. Yet, the freedoms he enjoyed could not shield him from the deceptive dangers lurking in a society where the color of his skin could render him vulnerable at any moment. Enticed by the promise of a lucrative opportunity to perform with a traveling troupe, Northup accepted an offer that seemed innocent enough. But in Washington, D.C., he was drugged, abducted, and sold into slavery, a brutal inversion of everything he had known and cherished. The following 12 years of Northup's life were marked by relentless toil, physical abuse, and the psychological torment that accompanied being stripped of autonomy and treated as mere property. From the sweltering cotton fields of Louisiana to the oppressive interiors of plantations, he endured labor that was both exhausting and dehumanizing, witnessing firsthand the daily subjugation and cruelty inflicted upon men, women, and children who were denied even the most basic human rights. Each master he encountered varied in temperament and severity, but the overarching reality was the same. His identity was ignored, his voice silenced, and his freedom suspended by a society willing to commodify human beings for economic gain. Despite these conditions, Northup's resilience remained unbroken, as he relied on intelligence, observation, and careful navigation of the social hierarchies among enslaved people and their captors to survive, fostering alliances and quietly asserting his agency whenever possible. Northup's ingenuity extended beyond mere survival. He became a source of knowledge and instruction for those around him, teaching fellow enslaved individuals to read and write in secret, acts that were both illegal and extraordinarily risky, but that preserved a sense of dignity and self-determination within a system designed to erase it. These clandestine educational efforts were not simply acts of defiance but a lifeline of hope. Creating small, persistent flames of resistance that sustained the spirits of those who faced the daily indignities of bondage. Within the plantation communities, social bonds and covert networks allowed individuals to share information, protect one another, and maintain some semblance of autonomy, demonstrating that even in the darkest conditions, human beings could assert moral and intellectual freedom despite physical captivity. The turning point in Northup's story came through the unexpected alliance with Samuel Bass, a Canadian carpenter who held anti-slavery views and recognized the fundamental injustice of Northup's condition. Bass facilitated contact between Northup and friends and family in New York, setting in motion a legal intervention that would eventually restore his freedom. This moment underscores the complex interplay of chance, moral courage, and human solidarity that characterized the struggle against slavery. While systemic oppression created nearly insurmountable barriers, the intervention of a principled individual could alter the trajectory of a life, highlighting both the vulnerability of the oppressed and the transformative potential of allyship. Northup's liberation was not merely personal. It represented a vindication of resilience, ingenuity, and the unwavering pursuit of justice against overwhelming odds. Upon regaining his freedom, Northup took the extraordinary step of documenting his 12 years of enslavement in his memoir, 12 Years a Slave, a vivid and unflinching account that laid bare the systemic horrors, daily humiliations, and psychological torment of life under slavery. His narrative combined personal experience with meticulous observation, providing detailed portraits of the labor, discipline, and social dynamics that defined plantations, while also capturing the emotional landscapes of fear, hope, endurance, and occasional camaraderie among enslaved individuals. The book became an essential contribution to the abolitionist movement, offering Northern audiences concrete evidence of the human cost of slavery and challenging any lingering complacency or indifference regarding its existence. Northup's memoir not only preserved the memory of his ordeal, but also amplified the voices of countless others who had endured similar suffering, ensuring that the realities of slavery could not be sanitized, ignored, or forgotten. Through his writing, Northup conveyed the profound ethical questions that slavery posed to society, the tension between law and morality, the complicity of ordinary citizens in systems of oppression, and the moral imperative to act against injustice even when doing so carried personal risk. His narrative illustrated that freedom was fragile, contingent on both legal protections and the vigilance of a community committed to justice, and that the denial of liberty inflicted harm not only on the enslaved but also on the moral conscience of the broader society. By chronicling the brutalities he endured and the resilience he maintained, Northup offered a powerful testament to the capacity of human beings to survive, adapt, and reclaim dignity in the face of overwhelming adversity. Moreover, Northup's story illuminated the broader structural mechanisms of slavery, including the ways in which law, commerce, and social attitudes intersected to maintain the system, and how these structures could ensnare even those who were legally free. His abduction underscored the precariousness of freedom for African Americans, revealing that liberty was never guaranteed in a nation where racial prejudice and economic interests often outweighed justice. At the same time, the response to his plight, including the intervention of allies and the dissemination of his narrative, demonstrated the potential for moral action and social advocacy to counteract systemic oppression, reinforcing the idea that individual courage and collective commitment could challenge entrenched injustices. In recounting Solomon Northup's ordeal, one sees the interplay of misfortune, resilience, moral courage, and social support that defined the lived experience of many African Americans in antebellum America. His 12 years of enslavement, followed by his triumphant return to freedom and his courageous act of bearing witness through memoir, provide a profound lens through which to understand both the horrors of slavery and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Northup's story remains a vital reminder that freedom, justice, and dignity must be vigilantly defended, and that the testimony of those who endured oppression is an indispensable force in the ongoing pursuit of equality and human rights. By the mid-1850s, the Fugitive Slave Act had become more than just a legal statute. It had evolved into a symbol of the deepening moral and political chasm between the North and South, a catalyst that exposed the irreconcilable differences within the United States and set the stage for the most devastating conflict the nation had ever faced. Across northern cities, communities of abolitionists, free African Americans, and sympathetic citizens were galvanized into action, compelled to confront a law that mandated complicity in the perpetuation of human bondage. In Boston, the harrowing case of Anthony Burns had already demonstrated the law's capacity to reach into free states, snatch men from their homes and workplaces, and return them to lives of unimaginable suffering. Igniting protests that filled the streets and drew widespread attention, these acts of defiance, while grounded in local moral outrage, collectively signaled a growing unwillingness to tolerate legislation that forced citizens to betray their conscience. And they resonated beyond city limits, capturing the attention of the press, politicians, and the broader public. The resistance to the act was multifaceted, encompassing legal challenges, public demonstrations, and the covert operations of the Underground Railroad, all of which amplified the visibility of the moral crisis at the heart of American slavery. People like Harriet Tubman and Levi Coffin exemplified the courage required to subvert an oppressive law, their actions transforming what was legally criminal into an ethically imperative mission. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens across the North, clergy, business owners, students, and homemakers found themselves morally compelled to provide aid and shelter to escapees, often at great personal risk. Each successful act of resistance sent a message that law and morality could collide, and that ordinary individuals possessed the capacity to assert justice even against the weight of federal authority. Newspapers chronicled these defiant acts, spreading both outrage and inspiration, ensuring that the stories of struggle and resistance reached audiences far beyond the immediate locales where the events unfolded. Politically, the Fugitive Slave Act exacerbated sectional tensions by laying bare the stark contrast between Northern and Southern interests and values. Southern politicians and slaveholders regarded the law as essential to preserving their economic and social systems, while Northern communities increasingly viewed it as an infringement upon personal liberty. State sovereignty and moral responsibility. This polarization intensified debates in Congress, inflamed public opinion, and fueled a growing sense of inevitability that compromise was no longer sufficient to reconcile the divergent visions for the nation's future. The law had inadvertently created a moral battlefield where every enforcement action became a flashpoint for protest, and every act of civil disobedience was interpreted as a challenge to Southern authority, deepening mistrust and hostility between regions. Resistance to the act also revealed the fragility of the legal mechanisms intended to enforce slavery, as many Northern juries refused to convict those accused of aiding fugitives, and local authorities frequently turned a blind eye to escape efforts, prioritizing community acts over federal mandates. These repeated acts of non-compliance undermined the effectiveness of the law, highlighting a growing divide not only between states but within the nation's legal and civic culture. The visibility of these conflicts, including public confrontations, court cases, and the dramatic rescues of fugitive slaves, made it increasingly clear that the nation was grappling with an existential struggle over the meaning of liberty, justice, and equality, and that the resolution would require more than legislative compromise. As tensions escalated, the moral and political climate surrounding slavery reached a fever pitch. Northern communities became hotbeds of abolitionist activity, leveraging moral persuasion, political organization, and direct action to resist the law, while Southern leaders perceived these efforts as existential threats to their way of life, particularly in the years following the publication of harrowing narratives such as Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave, which humanized the suffering inflicted by slavery and amplified the urgency of moral resistance. Literature, speeches, and public demonstrations all contributed to a culture of heightened awareness and activism, reinforcing the idea that the Fugitive Slave Act was not merely a legal challenge, but a profound ethical dilemma that required public confrontation. The North's persistent defiance, coupled with Southern insistence on enforcing the law, set in motion a chain of events that made reconciliation increasingly unlikely. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 crystallized the tensions that had been brewing for more than a decade. As Southern states interpreted his anti-slavery stance as a direct threat to their economic and social order, resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act had, by this, transformed from scattered local acts of defiance into a coherent expression of sectional identity and moral principle, with the North increasingly united in opposition to the imposition of laws that perpetuated slavery. Southern leaders, in turn, acted on the belief that secession was necessary to safeguard their institutions, leading to the formation of the Confederate States of America and the formal outbreak of hostilities that would become the Civil War. The cumulative effect of decades of legal, social, and moral confrontation over slavery, and particularly over the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, had made conflict almost inevitable, as compromise was no longer possible in a nation divided by irreconcilable conceptions of freedom and human dignity. The Civil War itself, though catastrophic in its human cost, ultimately underscored the transformative power of sustained resistance and moral courage. The Union victory, the abolition of slavery, and the redefinition of civil rights were direct outcomes of the persistent defiance that had been catalyzed, in part, by the Fugitive Slave Act. By compelling citizens to confront the ethical limits of law and justice, the act intensified moral awareness, galvanized organized resistance, and demonstrated the profound societal consequences that occur when laws demand complicity in oppression. The legacy of this resistance extends far beyond the battlefield, serving as a reminder that individual and collective action, rooted in conscience and guided by principles of justice, can alter the course of history and challenge deeply entrenched systems of injustice. Through the lens of history, it becomes evident that the Fugitive Slave Act was more than a statute. It was a spark that illuminated the nation's moral fault lines, transformed public awareness, and propelled the United States toward a conflict whose resolution would redefine liberty and human rights. The stories of defiance, courage, and solidarity in the face of oppression, whether in Boston, along the Underground Railroad, or in the broader abolitionist movement, reveal the intricate interplay between law, morality, and human agency, showing that resistance, even against formidable odds, can sow the seeds of transformative change and ultimately reshape the destiny of a nation. As we reflect on the history of the Fugitive Slave Act and its far-reaching consequences, it becomes clear that this law was not merely a set of regulations, but a stark embodiment of the cruelty and injustice inherent in the institution of slavery. By mandating that citizens participate in the capture and return of runaway slaves, it blurred the lines between legal obligation and moral conscience, forcing ordinary individuals to confront the human cost of systemic oppression. The act exposed the vulnerability of both escaped and free African Americans, illustrating how freedom could be stripped away at any moment through deception, coercion, or violence. Families were torn apart, communities lived under constant fear, and the humanity of countless individuals was denied, reduced to property in the eyes of the law. Yet, in the face of such darkness, remarkable courage emerged, illuminating the strength, resilience, and indomitable spirit of those who resisted oppression at every turn. Figures such as Harriet Tubman, whose bravery on the Underground Railroad became legendary, and Levi Coffin, whose home served as a sanctuary for hundreds of escapees, remind us that resistance was not only possible but transformative. These individuals risked their lives to guide others toward liberty, challenging laws that were morally reprehensible and demonstrating the profound impact of individual and collective action. Similarly, Solomon Northup's harrowing experience and eventual memoir, 12 Years a Slave, provided the world with a first-hand account of slavery's horrors, humanizing the struggles of the oppressed and inspiring countless others to join the fight for justice. The story of Anthony Burns further highlights how public protest, civic engagement, and moral outrage could confront unjust laws, galvanizing entire communities to stand against systemic injustice and demand accountability. The legacy of the Fugitive Slave Act and the resistance it provoked extends far beyond its historical moment. It served as a catalyst for the abolitionist movement, heightened sectional tensions between the North and South, and ultimately contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War, a conflict that, despite its devastating toll, led to the abolition of slavery and reshaped the moral and political landscape of the United States. Through these events, we witness a profound lesson: that laws, no matter how entrenched, can be challenged through courage, empathy, and persistent advocacy, and that individual actions, when multiplied across communities, can effect lasting social change. The resilience and bravery of those who fought against slavery, both the enslaved and their allies, remain an enduring testament to the human capacity for hope, justice, and solidarity. Today, remembering these stories is more than an act of historical reflection. It is a reminder of our ongoing responsibility to uphold human dignity and confront injustice wherever it persists. The courage demonstrated by individuals in the past inspires us to examine our own actions and commitments, to recognize where moral courage is required, and to contribute to a world where liberty and justice are not conditional but universal. The history of the Fugitive Slave Act teaches that freedom is never guaranteed, that vigilance and courage are necessary to protect it, and that even in the darkest times, human beings have the capacity to resist, to aid, and to reclaim dignity and agency. Thank you so much for watching and taking the time to engage with this history. Your attention to these stories helps keep the memory and lessons alive, ensuring that the courage of those who fought for freedom continues to inspire new generations. If you found this video meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel and join us in exploring more stories that illuminate the struggles, resilience, and triumphs of humanity. Your support allows us to continue sharing these important narratives and to spark thoughtful conversations about history, justice, and morality. Wishing you a peaceful and reflective evening, and as you close your day, may the stories of courage and resilience inspire hope, empathy, and determination in your own life. Good night, and sleep well.